That's a great question. A lot depends on where you're starting from. So many countries are starting from a situation where they have a lot of use of quantitative trade restrictions. I've just spent a couple of weeks in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries where you've had export bans, you've got state trading, state imports. These policies are an important place to start because they end up creating a lot of price volatility. Imports come into surplus, exports go out, the situation's very hard to predict. So a general rule for trade reform is to actually start by getting rid of any quantitative restrictions that you have. Now that doesn't mean that you should be going straight to free trade or anything like that. It's a matter of moving away from those quantity-based instruments to price-based ones. So perhaps put in place a set of tariffs, or if you want low consumer prices, a set of export taxes, and then start to reform from there. These are going to lead to a much more predictable situation than the quantitative restrictions, and they're going to give you an opportunity, they'll give the private sector an opportunity to do what it can do well, which is, to take a risk on bringing food in when it might be needed, or to export when it might be in surplus. So I think is a key. Another important thing is actually, if you can, to make it a broad-based reform rather than trying to do it one sector at a time. It's most desirable to get down the high rates of protection, because high rates of protection are very costly. They pull the resources, your limited resources, into producing things that cost a lot more than you could obtain the same good by buying it internationally. And they create those inefficiencies and distortions. It's much better to start by reducing those, maybe reducing all of your protection in a fairly uniform manner so people know what's going on. Ideally, you'd do that with a reform that also lowers the cost to agriculture of goods coming from the manufacturing sector. That can be very, very important to make sure that you have inputs available at reasonable prices to the modern agricultural, modernising agricultural sector. Because what you want to do is get to an efficient agricultural sector that creates opportunities for particularly for relatively unskilled, poorer people in the economy. I think what a lot of people forget, there's a lot of emphasis today, on the desirability or perceived desirability of, local production and eating local food and so on. But I think what a lot of people forget is that the big source of volatility in agriculture, especially in rain-fed agriculture that you have the type in Morocco, is big fluctuations in yield depending on whether the rains are good or bad in a particular year. If you remain tightly self-sufficient, you end up rocketing from feast to famine. You end up with very, very serious adverse consequences. If you look at the volatility, for instance, of wheat yields in Morocco, if you look at the standard measure, coefficient of variation, it's about 40%. If you look at world volatility, world production, a much more diversified source of supply, it's less than 10%. So if you can diversify your sources of supply, you can actually lower volatility a great deal. So, because another important dimension of integrating with world markets is that you can expect to be able to get a big increase in national income. This is an insight that goes back to David Ricardo in 1817, who pointed out that if you are more efficient in one good relative to another, the theory of comparative advantage, by trading, you can substantially raise incomes. This is particularly prominent in agriculture, where we have very different amounts of land per person. If you look at the diversity based on countries' historical experience, you have some countries like the United States, Brazil, Australia, with enormous amounts of land per person, and not surprisingly, they're agricultural exporters. Then you have countries like Japan, Korea, with very, very little land per person. If you try to grow all the food desired by people in Japan or Korea, the prices would be absolutely, if they tried to grow it all at home, the prices would be absolutely astronomical, and they would be extremely low in the exporting countries. Both exporters and importers can gain, and because it's going to be a much less volatile situation, everyone gains from, both in terms of higher incomes, more food security associated with that, lower volatility associated with that. You end up with much higher levels of food security. Well, regionalism has two dimensions to it. One is that it can help you create trade between trading partners. The other is that it can divert trade away from the more efficient supplier to another. So I think there's actually what I would prefer would actually be that countries get together in one big regional arrangement, something like the WTO, and try to reduce their protection on a non-discriminatory basis. But at the moment, that's pretty hard to do. As we've seen, the Doha Agenda negotiations have run aground. The last successful big negotiation we had was the one signed into effect at Marrakesh in 1994. So we might need to try some other alternatives. Regional agreements between developing countries can be a useful way of getting distortions down, of getting more access to other markets, to allow your farmers, for instance, to take advantage of opportunities, with new value chains to raise their incomes. And there is, I think, a lot of opportunity to do that. I think the key is to see this as a set of building blocks towards a broader liberalisation process. So Morocco already has agreements with Europe, with the United States. Adding agreements with developing countries could be another important step forward. I don't have sort of a detailed knowledge of that. I do think that there really are likely to be some important opportunities for integration within Africa writ large. Let me see, I think one thing I would probably tend to suggest would be to avoid going into, say, a customs union type arrangement. That would be very hard, because then if you have a customs union, you then have to give up your free trade agreements with other countries. But moving along the path of a free trade agreement, I think could make a lot of sense. I think we did a class exercise that looked at the possible gains for Morocco from an FTA with ECOWAS, and it looked pretty promising. That initial back of the envelope calculation would certainly be worth more careful study. But I think the recent economic literature sort of suggests that there's a better case for moving ahead in general with free trade areas rather than with customs unions, partly because once you have moved in an FTA, you've agreed to lower your protection, there's a tendency then to find the diversion of trade towards the partner and away from other countries to be burdensome, and to move towards, therefore to move to broader liberalisation. So I think there is a case for going down the FTA path, definitely worth considering.